Last night, I listened to a podcast that's new to me for the first time. The podcast is called Ear Hustle, and it's recorded in San Quentin. And I listened to the second episode titled Misguided Loyalty. I haven't listened to the first episode first. But it was the story of a guy. His name, if I'm remembering it right, his name is Shakur, and his gang moniker, he was a member of a particular subset of the Crips, and his gang moniker, or his gang name, was Joker. And they tell the story about how he got into being a member of a gang, and as a result, killing someone who met him in a public place and said something that was very provocative if you spoke the inside talk of the gang world. But looking back, killing someone just because they said something made no sense to him. In telling the whole story of how he wound up there, he started off telling the story of his family and about how his father was a pastor, and the family, they had high hopes that he, Shakur, Joker, was going to become a pastor as well. And so he would get in trouble if he misbehaved, and in particular, if he misbehaved in church. His mother was a very, very kind person, very warm person, but his father was very strict and very, very demanding. And so when he got in trouble, his father would beat him very, very severely. And where I begin with what I'm thinking about this week is I'm thinking about things that look like they work, but they're not going to work forever. And you can't always see when their effectiveness starts to fade. And you definitely can't always see the point where you move into diminishing returns, or even the point where something that looks like it's worked until now begins to backfire. And the first example of this I put down when this thought crossed my mind was indiscriminate corporal punishment. If you are raising a child, and every time the child behaves in a way that you don't want, you inflict pain on the child, in the near term, it may look as though you shut off that behavior you don't want like a light switch. But something I talk about with my students whenever I talk about power is when you use violence or even other forms of coercion, just hanging threats over them. Maybe you're the manager and you threaten to dock the pay of your workers if they behave a way you don't like. Anytime you have to exercise power by coercing, you have created the incentive for the person who was on the receiving end of that power move, for them to go out and find a source of power that's bigger. If you beat someone up to get your way, you've created the incentive for them to go out to get stronger, to learn how to fight better, or to find more people to fight alongside them, maybe to go out and join a gang. When you create that incentive, you shouldn't be surprised at what happens. And another form of power that has violence and coercion built into it is harnessing hatred and demagoguery. And just as a reminder, demagoguery, the idea behind demagoguery is you persuade your target audience by saying, we, all of you and myself, we are separate from our enemies. Our enemies are over there. The people who disagree with me are our enemies. You therefore should listen to me and not even listen to them. You should listen only to me and disregard them, because they are dangerous. They are out to do you harm, and you can only trust me. And those strategies, they work. They really do work, but they don't work forever. And the kind of incentives that they create and the unexpected, unintended side effects, the collateral damage that goes along with them, you can't always see it at the moment where you take the shortcut and you get where you want. You get what you want. But you are building up those consequences, and the time is going to come when you're going to have to deal with them. And probably it's the case that just what happened in the last electoral cycle and the current dysfunctions we have in politics and the operating of community. Those are the leftover collateral damage of some strategies, political strategies, that people have been using for a very, very long time. One of the things I jotted down in trying to make sense of this was the backdrop can make a difference. The context can make a difference, but it's not going to make a complete difference. If you're raising a child using lots and lots of corporal punishment, and you're in a community where violence is normal, so all the parents use lots of corporal punishment with their kids, and your child goes out to interact with other kids and hears the story of them getting whipped as well, then it may change the timeline, but it doesn't change the fundamental effect. They may regard what's going on as normal, but the incentive to go out and get power of their own, that still exists. And it may be that if violence is more normal in a community like that it's easier for them to find their rival power source. And really the way for everyone to work through their disagreements and for parents to raise their children without violence being the output, the end product, is for nobody to resort to it. And I don't know, maybe I need to do another episode about corporal punishment, because the feelings I have about corporal punishment, I'm not a parent, so it's pretty much just sort of idle speculation on my part. I have views on corporal punishment. They are in part informed by research. They are in part informed by philosophy and also by my own experience, because I think that's where most people's views of corporal punishment come from. But that's just one subset, and don't confuse the example for the principle. Coercion, violence, pain, fear, any of those tactics, exercising power by exposing someone to something aversive, something they want to escape from, it works momentarily. It's not going to work forever. And you think you can keep using it until the point where it's no longer working as well, but it may not be clear to you when that moment arrives. One of the things, when you're at a point in history where there are signs of danger, where there are signs of instability and not knowing day to day what's going to happen, those are periods in history, I think, where hatred takes longer to run out of fuel that keeps it ignited. Hatred takes longer to burn itself out. And I don't know, maybe I'm being naive in saying that hatred will burn itself out. You look at what goes on in the Balkans, or you look at what's gone on in Ireland, and pretty much two different sides exacting their cycles of retribution. They keep igniting the hatred. They keep chewing on the wound and never letting it heal. So I don't know, maybe I'm not thinking right in saying that eventually the distrust that we have has got to work itself out. We've got to get to a point where things are so dysfunctional that we are finally ready to try it another way. To put it in the language of folk wisdom about addiction, we've got to reach a point where we hit bottom. But I don't know. Maybe we don't have to reach that point. The last thing that I put down in thinking about sustainability was the idea of a Ponzi scheme. A Ponzi scheme being a particular kind of swindle where you take in the money of some of your customers and you make a claim that you're going to invest the money. You're going to put the money to work in such a way that they'll get a big return. But really all you do is you take their money and you pay the people who came before you. And there was an investment, a very, very well-respected, legendary investment broker named Bernie Madoff, who, if you were to Google him and read his story, I think that's the most recent, really, really glaring example of a Ponzi scheme, or you could just look up Ponzi. But the point is, Ponzi schemes work for the moment, but eventually they run out of gas. And so it occurs to me that trying to run your government on coercion and threats and hatred and demagoguery is very much a Ponzi scheme. It looks very powerful right now, but it's hard to believe that it's sustainable over the long haul. And then you got to worry about what is the collateral damage going to be along the way. What are we going to habituate ourselves to? What have we made more thinkable? What have we introduced into the whole repertoire of political moves that nobody ever would have used because nobody could imagine them being acceptable, but now we've seen them used, and so now they are imaginable. They're thinkable. So where I went from there was to an argument that I am mortally tired of hearing. An argument that doesn't work, and it's time to retire it. And that argument is, imagine if Obama had. So this past week, President Trump went to the G20 meeting in Europe, and there was one session, I believe on refugees, where he was not able to be there because he was off meeting one-on-one with some other world leaders, and the person that he sent to take his place was not anyone from the State Department, it was his daughter. And immediately, people began to say, imagine if Bill Clinton had gone to an international conference and let Chelsea sit in for him. Imagine if Barack Obama had gone to an international conference and let one of his daughters sit in for him. All the people opposed to either one of those presidents would have come absolutely unglued. But that argument doesn't work, and it's never going to work. It's an argument that has kind of an implicit claim that this is hypocrisy to treat these by different standards, but the problem is what you want that argument to do. There are a couple of purposes you have for it, and one of the purposes has a point and the other has no point at all, or at least no constructive point. One of the purposes is to help those same people who would have been opponents of President Clinton and President Obama to see that the same things they criticize those other presidents for, the president they support is now doing those things, and thereby you hope that if you make that argument, you'll weaken their support. That's never going to work. And what I talked about in the past about how we move from universalism to particularism depending on how urgent it feels to us to be loyal, to cling to our groups. We are always going to hold those we recognize as being of our group to a different standard. And intellectually, it will feel completely comfortable to do so, and we will find all kinds of details to use to distinguish the cases and say it's not the same thing at all. And definitely when that's paired with demagoguery and the criticism of hypocrisy is coming from someone who is not a member of the group, that charge has absolutely no force to it. Now, the other purpose that argument might have might be that all the people who oppose Donald Trump, President Trump, and I count myself as one of them, that if we circulate that argument among ourselves, we can just get a little angrier. Well, that anger isn't doing anybody any good. It has no constructive purpose. Becoming enraged, wanting to engage the conflict, wanting to lash out, wanting to do damage, that's not the way to make anything desirable, to get to any desirable end state in this situation. President Trump thrives on conflict. He thrives on being called names and calling names back. And he's shown over and over again that if the source of power is shock, outrage, fury, enmity, he's better at it. Because there are fewer things that he'll stop and say, no, that's line crossing. His line is much further out. Or it could be that he knows right where the line is, but a tactic that's worked for him over and over again is to see the line clearly and cross it. And if that's the case, then when people who agree with me politically make arguments that will not persuade their political opponents and will only anger their political allies, they're not accomplishing anything. Marshall McLuhan talked about how the medium is the message, and that became a slogan that a lot of people like to repeat that buzz phrase, and I think about half of the people who repeat that have no idea what he meant by that. But when I teach McLuhan in some of my classes, the thing that you have to say immediately after that, the medium is the message, the content is almost beside the point. People who write episodes for sitcoms every week, it doesn't really matter what happens in the sitcom. What you need is you need to sell eyeballs. And what McLuhan got people to thinking about was, it's not necessarily whether television is violent, it's not necessarily whether television is sexually suggestive. Those are certainly topics that people can study, people can and do study, but there's a topic beyond that that people were ignoring, which is the experience of watching television by itself or of being connected to a digital device. Any of those experiences using the medium works changes on the people who are consuming those mediated messages. I was listening to an interview on National Public Radio. That's mostly what I consume. And this is an idea that I'm bumping into more and more different places. I can't pin down who the person is that I should attribute this to, but the distinction between patriotism and nationalism. The idea is that patriotism, well, let me do it backwards. Someone who is nationalist loves his own people, the people he recognizes as belonging to his nation, and hates and is opposed to people from other nations. Patriotism, on the other hand, is the idea that you can love your own nation and respect others, and that that's completely consistent. And the thing that Donald Trump keeps flirting with, keeps sort of dipping his toe into, I mean, this feels like saying the most obvious thing in the world, but he keeps using glorification of the United States as an implicit reason that other nations are to be seen as opponents, that they're to be seen as enemies. And it's that joining of conflict, it's that friction that he uses in a lot of circumstances with a lot of people who feel very unsafe, a lot of people who feel that their needs are not being met. He solidifies that fear using opposing the United States to other nations, using that particular kind of demagoguery. And where I finally got to after thinking about that, this is something that I think I've brought up before, but it's on my mind again this week, which is that the people who are most successful, I think this may be the biggest, most glaring flaw in the way our particular kind of democratic form of governance works. The people who are the most successful, the people most likely to be reelected, to move up into the top positions of power, they are not the ones who solve problems. Instead, they are the ones who skillfully and effectively exploit problems. And the mental picture I got in thinking about this was of maybe a middle schooler who hates PE class and doesn't want to have to take part in PE class and just happens to get injured and really works that injury and keeps complaining that, oh, it still hurts, oh, it's still sore, oh, it's not healed yet, because the longer you exploit that injury, you don't have to dress out and go do PE class. And that's what office holders on both ends of the political spectrum, all points on the political spectrum, left-wing, right-wing, centrist, everybody. You find a problem and you keep drawing attention to the problem and think for a second, is it in their interest to make that problem go away? The Republican Party, the conservative wing in politics in the United States, was not rabidly anti-abortion for its entire history. You look at the history of the profile of abortion as an issue, and there was a time before it when mainstream conservative thought was, well, that's a medical decision, that's fairly private. But there came a point where they figured out how to use that issue. And that point is now almost 40 years in the past. It was around the time of the Reagan administration, roughly then. I mean, Roe versus Wade 1973 was a big flashpoint, no question, but still, it wasn't ready to be the leading issue, the litmus test, the thing that people talked about in deciding which candidate to vote for. It didn't reach that stage of maturity at that point. It did later on. And in 40 years, there have been all these proposals to try to put a stop to abortion. I remember back in the 1980s, the proposal was a human life amendment to the Constitution. There would be an amendment added to the Constitution saying life begins at conception and abortion is illegal. And you would think that the people who that's their focus issue, that's their spotlight issue, that they would have kept after that. They would not just have dropped that. But they benefit from it continuing to be an issue. It's almost an ATM. Anytime they need people to write checks, make campaign donations, all they have to do is talk in a way that raises their voters' fury about the current state of that issue. And I use abortion because it's an easy example, but the other example of it is race. And a lot of Democrats really do not want race relations to improve, because when they talk about racial injustice, about particular kinds of problems tied up with racial tension and racial friction, that's when they get their voters mobilized. That's when they get donations. That's when they get votes. It is in their interest to keep working it. That was on my mind this morning just because a few years ago, there was all this talk about the debt. That was a rhetorical strategy. That was an argumentative strategy. The second Barack Obama was in office, and it's kind of the penumbra, it's the rippling outward of the idea that Democrats are tax and spend, which is an idea that I think is taking forever to finally die. But at the time, the idea had teeth, and the idea got the Republicans some traction in trying to get their own voters mobilized. That the debt was out of control, entitlement spending was out of control, and entitlement spending is a problem. It is dysfunctional. I agree that something needs to be done about it. But the same folks who, while George W. Bush was in office, would say things like, deficits don't matter. Suddenly, Barack Obama is in office, and that problem needs to be talked about. That problem needs to be exploited, used as leverage, but it needs to be carefully managed to where it continues. You know, there was a time in the history of the human race when I think human beings probably were terrified of fire. Then they learned how to manage it and how to keep it in one place. And a lot of the particular issues that government is supposed to address, that I think most people would agree there needs to be a government solution to, there's not an incentive for the people holding office to come up with a long-term and sustainable, to bring it back to sustainability, a sustainable system for managing those issues. Well, manage is a loaded word. If we could come up with, for a lot of these issues, something that was an improvement. Well, okay, and I'm starting to get tangled up in my thoughts here. In the first place, we so quickly diverge when we try to think, what are needs? What are basic needs? What needs should the government be addressing to help people be safer, to have communities they can live in and pursue their own interests? And a lot of what we see as a need is tied up with our philosophy. So there's going to be a lot of disagreement. So that lack of consensus about what the needs even are, that's a stumbling block at the beginning. If we don't agree on what needs are, then how can we possibly agree on what solutions look like, as opposed to very carefully choreographed inflaming of problems to keep voters reliably outraged so that they can be exploited and brought out to provide their resources, their vote, and their donation? But I think, what if we could redesign our democratic institutions, or what if we, the voters, could somehow overcome these splits that we've got, this distrust that we've built up? What if we could reach some kind of consensus that the people who continue to aggravate the problem, the people who continue to use problems like this as leverage, that we're not going to get suckered into that? That we are going to see that for what it is. We are going to sensitize ourselves and sensitize one another to the exploiting of problems. And we're going to point out that that's not constructive, and we are going to support one another while we reject that. What would we have to build into our institutions, or what kinds of conversations would we have to have with one another to where we could reach that point? I know I've talked before about one of the basic building block ideas when I teach conflict, which is that you only ever solve a problem, you only ever solve a conflict or start to manage it more effectively when you can separate the positions from the interests. And the position is what each side demands, but the interest is why they need it. And when you get both sides to talking about why they need what they need, it's a lot easier to harmonize needs than it is to harmonize demands. And political parties and political platforms are textbook case of positions. But if you could get people who were adherents, people who identified themselves as either political party, if you could get them to talk about their needs, talk to one another, unfiltered, unmediated about their needs, and they could come to recognize one another's needs, and they could see how much overlap there already was. And if they could see that there are constructive things that could be done that would meet the needs of both sides. Boy, does it feel as though could be a way forward for the whole healthcare mess. And instead of there being some sort of healthcare bill that's going to get to 51 votes in the Senate and thereby make it across Donald Trump's desk, and symbolically a whole lot of leaders in Congress can say, we promised an Obamacare repeal, we gave you an Obamacare repeal. Nothing that's dysfunctional about healthcare in the United States has been addressed in any way, shape, or form, but we passed a bill that we can call an Obamacare repeal. We have spent a whole bunch of years saying Obamacare was the worst thing ever to happen to the country. A dysfunctional healthcare system is not as bad as the existence of Obamacare. We repealed it. That's what we promised. We met our promise. That, again, is just taking an issue and manipulating it and managing it so that you lead people through the choreographed sequence of emotions so that they do what you want them to do. So the idea that's been floating over me in thinking about all of this is the game that you're playing is not the game that you think you're playing. And I think about middle school kids, and in particular middle school boys, although middle school girls are also new to this particular game, trying to flirt. And very often, the two different people are not playing, each one is not playing the game that the other one thinks they're playing. And it's sad that the state we seem to be in, and I think this is at least part of the essence of our problem in operating as a community, is that we are not playing the game that we seem to be playing. And if we could reach the point of exasperation to where we said enough of this, and we're going to talk openly about our needs, and we're going to talk to one another about our needs, and we're going to stop listening to charismatic leaders and strong, in quotes, strong leaders who make big promises, maybe we could get to the point where the way we functioned in deliberating on issues of public interest, we could actually not go through this cycle again and again, but we could start undoing some of this collateral damage. Maybe.